Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek Voyager Season 3. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Star Trek Voyager, one season at a time. In this video, I'll go through every episode of Season 3 to give my thoughts on each episode. So, as I've been alluding to in earlier videos, Season 3 is one of my least favorite seasons of Voyager, and in fact, I'm curious to see which season I think will be worse, Season 3 or Season 7, which I believe are the two worst seasons of Voyager, but I'll have to wait until after I rewatch Season 7 to make that determination. In my opinion, the quality of Voyager took a massive dive in Season 3, but recovered with a renaissance in Season 4, but then gradually declined in quality after that. In fact, I would say talking about Season 3 is what inspired this entire series of videos that I'm doing in the first place. That is why I'm allowing a lot more time for this video, as it will be twice as long as my previous Voyager season reviews that I've done. But since I'm making such bold statements about Season 3 that a lot of people disagree with, I feel I need to take the time to explain why I feel that way properly. Now, doing some research, I find my opinion in this matter actually isn't a popular one. I've watched several videos that claim that it's pretty agreed upon by Voyager fans that Season 3 was an increase in quality from the first two seasons, and if this is true, I very strongly disagree with this opinion, as I thought the first two seasons had a strong sense of the characters and a strong sense of Voyager as a community, whereas Season 3 felt kind of distant and cold, with the characters being less interesting, which in turn makes the stories less interesting. And overall, I just feel Season 3 featured a lot more subpar episodes. In my Season 2 review, I talked about how there was a run of bad episodes at the start of the season, but there I was referring to like 5 or 6 episodes, whereas in Season 3, I'd say pretty much the first 2/3 of the season were made up of bad or otherwise subpar episodes, and to me, that's an enormous difference. Now, most of the episodes I consider subpar or poor are actually viewed quite highly by many fans. Some even put some of these episodes in their top 10s, so I will give a fair warning that some episodes I don't like and am about to give bad reviews for are fan favorites, but as always, I'm going to give my honest opinions and not sugarcoat things in order to appease fans. Now, it seems to me something must have went on behind the scenes with Star Trek overall this year, as Deep Space Nine was airing its 5th season at the same time that this season was airing, and I noticed a massive drop in quality in both shows from their previous seasons. Although admittedly the drop in quality in Deep Space Nine wasn't quite as bad as the drop in quality in Voyager, but it was still there. And not so coincidentally, both shows recovered with a run of good episodes at the end of the season, almost exactly at the same time. In fact, I remember watching both shows when they were first airing, and at the same time, they both came out with a promo, a trailer, if you will, that outlined the last 7 or so episodes that were left to air in the season, and we're like, oh, look at all these awesome episodes coming out. They're so much better than the crap you've seen before. And they were. And the promo was actually right. It's as if the producers and showrunners were aware of the drop in quality and came out with an effective plan to right the ship in both shows, and thus wanted to advertise to let the viewership know, don't worry, we're turning things around. Now, mind you, this was the only time such a commercial was made before or after this that outlined the rest of the season, so I do think that alone is very telling. So I don't know exactly what went on behind the scenes to account for this drop in quality in Star Trek, but I can guess. First of all, it should be noted that this was the year Star Trek First Contact was released, so one could speculate that the minds behind Star Trek were too focused on making this film, which was in fact a box office smash, while the ratings of Deep Space Nine and Voyager continued to decline. Another guess is this is when producer Michael Piller left the show, or at least he didn't play as vital of a role in Star Trek anymore, particularly Voyager, which he was directly involved with. And if you don't know who Michael Piller is, he was the head writer that came in Star Trek Next Generation Season 3 to turn that show around, and arguably that is the season that made the Next Generation the beloved show that it is now. And before this, it was viewed as a disaster, because it was. And he stayed with Next Generation until the end, as it maintained a relative level of high quality up until the end. And he was involved in the first 2 seasons of Voyager, where I feel, I know many disagree with me, but I very strongly feel maintained that same high level of quality. So I can't help but draw a connection to the massive drop in quality in Season 3 that just so happens to coincide with his departure of the show. In fact, Michael Piller was in fact very critical of Season 3 and felt that the direction that the show went in was not the one he felt it should go in, and I very strongly have to agree. So enough of the preamble, let me now get into each episode, starting with the premiere episode, Basics Part 2. Now, this was the resolution to the Season 2 cliffhanger, and it was fine. It was kind of a uniform and kind of by the numbers, as the cliffhanger set certain things up for the Voyager crew being stranded on this planet, having to deal with primitive natives, a volcano, and a monster, and these things happened in pretty much how you'd expect it to happen. Also, they set up Tom escaping in the shuttle to seek help from the Deus Ex Machina Talaxians, who have never been mentioned in the show before, in order to retake Voyager, and that's exactly what happened. They also set up Ensign Suter and the Doctor would be left on Voyager after the Chasm took over and would try to retake the ship from within. And this was actually the most interesting storyline of the episode. Seeing the interaction between Suter and the Doctor was simply amazing, as Suter was a recovering murder addict, for lack of a better term, and he had to indulge in his drug of choice in order to retake the ship, and the toll it took on him was really tragic, and seeing the Doctor help him through this and then honor his memory was really touching, and by far the high point of this episode. The rest of the episode was kind of blah, to be honest. What is interesting to note, though, that originally this episode was intended to be the beginning of an even longer storyline that would last the rest of the season, involving Seska and Chakotay's son, but instead they went in the exact opposite direction and killed off Seska and revealed that it wasn't really Chakotay's son, but Maj Kulla's. Now, first let me address that last one, because this is one of the worst examples of bad writing in the show, as the whole reveal of the Doctor saying, "Oh, this isn't Chakotay's son," was such an obvious and contrived way for the writers to simply sweep the storyline under the rug. It was sickening. I dare say it actually would have added an interesting dynamic to the show if Chakotay became a single father, but God forbid that Voyager actually have an ongoing storyline. Now, I can't say I had as big of an issue with them ending the Kazan storyline, as they were never really great, and the storyline was really starting to become tiresome. However, on the other hand, Seska was the best villain in the show, so I had mixed feelings about killing her off. But seeing how Voyager was constantly moving in one direction towards home, I figured that she had to go eventually. But it is interesting to note that the actress who played Seska was told her character would die several hours before she shot that scene, and she was understandably not happy about this, and I can't really say I blame her. Ensign Suter was also intended to be a recurring character and have a long-term story arc, but that too was swept under the carpet. But at least the way that was handled was actually really good and made for a great story. Otherwise, this episode was pretty by the numbers, average episode. So next episode is Flashback, and this was the Voyager episode made to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Star Trek, or 30th, I can't remember, whatever it was. Would have been 30th, actually, yeah. 30th anniversary of Star Trek. And of course, this was overshadowed by Deep Space Nine. 30th anniversary episode Trials and Tribulations, where the Deep Space Nine crew actually traveled back to the events of the Trouble with Tribbles using footage from that episode. Whereas here, Tuvok mind melds with Janeway to relive the memories where he was on the Excelsior with Captain Sulu during the events of Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. And I will say this about this episode. It was great seeing George Takei play Captain Sulu again, but that's really the only positive thing I had to say. The plot of the episode was thin, weak excuse to have an original series cameo about some stupid virus that nobody cares about. Many of the things that happened in this episode didn't contribute anything to this thin plot and was just there for nostalgia or for no reason whatsoever. And if you're going to do an episode with Captain Sulu where you have to refilm with George Takei, why revisit Star Trek VI? Why not just do something original? It really annoys me when they try to make up stories of, this is what happened at the same time of the thing, the thing that you already saw, but you didn't see this because it was happening off screen, but at the same time. I just hate that in general. It's annoying. So overall, not a good episode. Next episode is The Shoot, and to be perfectly honest, I didn't know this episode even existed until 4 years after it aired. I was watching reruns of Voyager on syndication. All of a sudden this episode came up and I had never even heard of it. I thought I saw every Voyager episode, but I soon found I wasn't missing much, as this was a pretty ordinary by the numbers, wrongfully accused prison episode, the likes of which we've seen before. I know what they were going for, having the episode where Harry is so desperate he has to explore his darker side. And at times it works, but most of the episode is just boring, with this new cellmate spouting nonsense about beating the cut punishment device, and the way Voyager finally manages to rescue them was too easy, so not a very good episode. After that comes The Swarm. Now, those who weren't watching Voyager when it first aired may not have seen the promos that they would release for each episode when it originally aired on UPN. The promos were very flashy, very sensationalized, and oftentimes very cheesy. Later, when it aired in reruns, they redid the promos, which were more straightforward kind of promos that you'd actually expect to see from a Star Trek episode, which is probably what most people saw on YouTube or some other things. But these original UPN trailers were beyond ridiculous, and I'll get a bit more of this as the video goes on. However, with The Swarm, the promo for this was presenting the Swarm like they were going to be this new unstoppable enemy, kind of like the Borg. The whole promo was like, "The Swarm," and it kept repeating, "The Swarm," in a whisper, and I'm like, why are you whispering? Anyway, I bring this up because despite the promo and the title of the episode, The Swarm was nothing more than the B story. And the main story of the episode was actually about the Doctor losing all of his memory because his program was overloaded with too much information. I mean, this storyline would have been fine had there been any follow-up to it whatsoever. I mean, the episode even ended with this ambiguous note, and yet next episode, reset button was hit, and it was never mentioned again. Oh, Voyager, you sure do love your reset button. And as for The Swarm, this was an interesting concept and had potential. The build-up to them with Neelix being all freaked out about them was interesting, but nothing really happened with them. The payoff was kind of just a disappointment, and we never see them again. So, yet again, the reset button strikes. So, then we get to False Prophets, which was a good idea. In fact, being the Star Trek nerd that I am, I was hoping Voyager would do a follow-up episode where they meet the Ferengi that got trapped in the Delta Quadrant in the Next Generation episode, The Price. So I was excited when I heard about this episode, but man, was I disappointed. Apparently, the show was trying to do more comedic episodes, and boy howdy did they suck at it. It reminded me a bit of a Piece of the Action. The whole way the society just mimicked the way of life, and it was even less believable here. And why in hell would you send Neelix to impersonate a Ferengi? Yeah, that's smart. Send the one person on the ship from the freaking Delta Quadrant that has zero knowledge about the Ferengi in order to impersonate them. Also, they had, this wormhole to the Alpha Quadrant right there in front of their face the whole time of this episode. Instead of just, going through it, they wasted time to kidnap these two annoying Ferengis. Yes, I know the Ferengis were wreaking havoc on the entire population of innocent people. But yet again, Janeway sacrifices their chance to return home in order to save a bunch of strangers. Gotta love her. So, next episode is Remember, and this is the one bright, shining exception in the first half of Voyager's third season, as this episode isn't just good, it's amazing. In fact, I would say this is one of the best episodes of the entire series. This was probably because this episode was actually originally a Next Generation script, and I'm not talking about a rough idea for an episode. I mean, it was a fully written, developed Next Generation script, and for some reason or another it just never got made, but the decision was made to rework it as a Voyager episode, and apparently very little was changed in order to fit the Voyager format, as the story mostly deals with guest stars anyway. The biggest change probably being that the story was originally centered on Counselor Troy, but it was changed to focus on B'Elanna. One of the writers involved felt this episode was not as good as the original Next Generation script, while the other writer involved thought this actually worked better as a Voyager script. However, now I can't really make an informed opinion on this, as I never read the original Next Generation script. However, just by judging on what I see in this episode, I seem to think that it does work better as a Voyager episode. Having B'Elanna in the main role seems much more interesting to me, as you have a character who's less empathetic and more volatile, gaining empathy for an entire race of people who are exterminated, whereas had it been Troy, I could see this easily turning into a boring episode where she comes off as whiny. However, the emotional impact of this episode is just so thick it's palatable. Roxana Dawson gives an amazing performance, possibly the best she's ever given in the entire series, and this also features amazing performances from the guest cast, most notably from actor Bruce Davison, whom some might recognize from appearances in the first X-Men film, shows like Lost, or movies like Runaway Jury, and many other films and TV shows. He was absolutely brilliant as Karina's despicable father who claimed to have her best interests at heart, but really was actively participating in a genocide. And doing some research for this episode, many writers behind the scene view this as a Holocaust analogy episode, including the writers, as this was apparently the intention. In fact, part of the reason this episode was delayed as long as it was because after the release of Schindler's List and several other films focusing on the Holocaust, it was thought that this episode would appear to be just jumping on the bandwagon. But honestly, I never thought of this as a straight-up Holocaust episode, just an episode about genocide in general that could apply to any historical genocide, not just the Holocaust. In fact, I found the biggest feature about the genocide doesn't really apply to the Holocaust, and that is the fact that the mainstream culture has tried to pretend that this genocide didn't take place. This would actually only apply to like an alternate reality where the Holocaust denial was mainstream, and the majority of people in the mainstream considered the Holocaust to be a conspiracy theory, which is not at all the case. So I look on this episode more than simply a Holocaust analogy, as it delves deeper into the power of propaganda and denialism, which is a very interesting subject to me. So it only makes this episode more powerful in my mind. But getting back to the silly UPN promos, I remember the promo for this episode focused entirely on the sexy dreams B'Elanna was having, and the promo played it off like this was going to be a sexy romance. Ooh, look at B'Elanna, she's getting down and dirty, ba 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 ba. And considering the fact that this was actually a pretty heavy episode about genocide and people denying it, that makes the promos misleading in the worst way possible, as those tuning in and expecting a light-hearted, sexy romp would be very unpleasantly surprised. But as I said, this was one of the best episodes of the entire series. But after that exceptional episode, we get back to the subpar mediocrity that Season 3 is, with another particularly bland episode, Sacred Ground. Now, perhaps it's just me. Perhaps those who have more of an interest in spirituality and religious rituals may find this episode more interesting, but me, I found it boring as hell, full of obvious cliches that I've seen dozens of times before, with the character journey Janeway goes on that I found contrived and that I do not buy, so not a good episode. So then we get to Future's End Parts 1 and 2, which is where I'm going to have to diverge from popular opinion, as I've seen these episodes pop up on many top 10s, and overall they seem to score quite highly with Voyager fans. And I must admit, when I first saw these episodes, I kind of phantom menaced them, a term that means I wanted to like these episodes, so I convinced myself that they were good. Because after all, it's a fun time travel episode where Voyager travels back to our present, and Star Trek 4 and City on the Edge of Forever were outstanding, so these episodes must be good too, right? Well, years later, after looking at these episodes with a more objective eye, I have to say that objectively, they are not good. The plot has so many holes all over the place to overall make this story nonsensical. The comedy fails to be funny, and the setting of the 1990s LA seems fake. Characters like Rain Robinson and Henry Sterling, who were played by Sarah Silverman and Ed Begley Jr. respectively, were both really good actors, but they were just poorly written characters and seemed like TV cliches and not real people. Rain Robinson felt like a dad who's in his 50s, his idea of what teenagers or young adults would act like, and the type of slang they would use. And Henry Sterling felt like a teenager's imagining of what an evil CEO supervillain would be like. And the whole entire setting of 1990s Los Angeles, particularly with the scene with the Janeway and the others on the beach, felt like a fake studio set with paid actors and not the real LA landscape. Now you might say, well, that's because it was a TV studio with paid actors. Yes, but the whole point of TV and fiction is to make me forget that, to convince me that I'm watching real life, not remind me of how fake it is. That is the definition of failure in TV terms. But let me get back to this nonsensical time travel plot. So it starts with a captain from the 29th century traveling back and expecting Voyager would simply let him destroy their ship, and actually surprise when they resisted. Oh, really? They don't want to be killed? Oh, what a shocker. And he still blamed them years later for not wanting to die. And he explained the order of events and how it was an inevitable time loop. And we see things start to play out as exactly as predicted, that they're stuck in this time loop, as A leads to B, leads to C, as he says, and C leads to A, or however he said it. But then suddenly the cycle is broken and they avoid the disaster in the future. How is the cycle broken? How did they manage to break free of this time loop? I couldn't tell you, because this was never explained. Voyager simply stopped Henry Sterling from going to the future, so really there was no time loop, which means the entire premise for this episode falls completely apart. And then Braxton just shows up claiming no knowledge of prior events and says he just detected Voyager was in the wrong time, so he shows up to take him back to the right time. So that being the case, here's my question. Where was Braxton all the other times we've seen ships travel to the wrong time? Why didn't he show up in Star Trek 4 and be like, excuse me, Kirk, you're not supposed to be in this timeline. Let me take you back to your right timeline. And many other times he could have just popped up and be like, you're in the wrong time. But no, he just so happens to fall up in the one case where he was actually relevant to the story beforehand. Also, when he said, I didn't experience that timeline, shouldn't that alert him to the fact that the timeline has been altered, which apparently is his whole freaking job to prevent? And don't get me started on the whole BS of all the computer technology from the 20th century comes from this time ship. That means the entire timeline has been altered, yet was meant to happen, yet the whole thing is a paradox and couldn't happen, and it didn't happen because they changed it. Fuck! I can tell you this episode is more frustrating the more you think about it. And for that matter, why would Braxton let the Doctor keep his mobile emitter from the 29th century? Him having it could severely alter the timeline, as we even see in later seasons, that he, once he returns home, he plans on mass producing it so all the holograms can use it. How much would that freaking damage the timeline? Like beyond repair. Yet Braxton doesn't give a shit about that. Okay, so the one good thing I will say about these episodes is that I did like Tom Paris and Rain Robinson's relationship. I thought it was cute and it worked really well and I totally bought it. But that's about it. Other than that, I'm going to have to go against popular opinion and say that these episodes are actually very poor. So then we get to Warlord, which I know the producers were trying to make an exciting, action-packed episode. And Jennifer Lee, who plays Cass, did an amazing job in this episode and really showed off her acting chops. But overall, I'd have to say this episode falls apart. It fails at immersing me in the characters and situation and fails to get me to care about anything that's going on. It all happens too suddenly and focuses too much on characters that I don't care about to be effective. In fact, I never saw this as a good episode. Watching it now, I realize it's not quite as bad as I remembered, as you do have things like Cass's performance, the internal struggle she goes through to try to get rid of this madman, which is interesting. But I'd say overall this episode is still a failure. What I remember most about this episode is, to me, this marks the beginning of when Voyager started destroying Cass's character. It was obvious to me the writers had no idea what to do with her, where I say they should have just left her as she was. But it seemed obvious to me they were under studio pressure to make her more edgy and more sexy, and thus her character would degrade to the point where by the end of the season they had to write her off the show because it was the only appropriate way to handle this character who became so jumbled and mixed up. She no longer worked as a believable character. And I'll cover this a bit more throughout the rest of this review, but in this episode in particular, the biggest fumble was having her break up with Neelix, which was done obviously because they wanted to have her free and single, so go out and have raunchy sex and sex appeal and blah blah blah, have her flirt with other women like she did in this episode because the man's controlling her body. It was just an obvious attempt to ramp up the hot girl on girl action appeal. Now, I liked her with Neelix, and they remain one of my all-time favorite track couples in the entire franchise. So my review of the episode Jatrell, where I talked about an example of how well their relationship worked. So tearing them apart for no good reason was one of the show's worst blunders in my opinion. In fact, I was shocked when their breakup had lasting effects because she was, after all, being controlled by a crazed warlord when she broke up with him, but apparently it actually does have binding effects, so whatever. Anyway, let's move on to the Q and the Gray. Now, I recently did a full-length review on this episode, which you can check out if you want to hear my full thoughts in more detail. Here, I will just say, this is another shining example of Season 3 managing to fuck up concepts that sound good on paper, but when the finished product comes out, it's just a mess of silly nonsense. I don't know what was going on with the writing staff in Season 3, but whatever it was not good. Here, Q was portrayed as an annoying frat boy who should be sued for sexual harassment, and the Voyager crew can just storm into the Q continuum and hold all the other Q hostage with muskets. Next. Okay, so then we get to Macrocosm, which, when it first aired, I was actually one of my favorite episodes of the season. I felt this episode did an amazing job at creating tension and ramping up the exciting levels. However, over the years, I found there's not that much to this episode. Therefore, it gets less interesting with each viewing, which is not a good sign. This episode seems to me like a mix of two Next Generation episodes, Starship Mine and Genesis. One where Picard has to go all die-hard on a group of mercenaries in order to get his ship back, and the other a horror story where Picard and Data return to the ship to find it a haunted house overrun by scary creatures. This episode combines those two episodes by having Janeway and Neelix return to Voyager to find a haunted house overrun by scary creatures, but then Janeway must go all die hard on them to get her ship back. And that's fine. I think it works on that level, but there's not much more to it than that. So overall, I would say it was a moderately good episode. So next we get to Fair Trade, which is another of episodes which I would call moderately good. It tells an interesting story of Neelix having outlived his usefulness as they entered the Nectron expanse, whatever it's called, an area of space beyond what he knows absolutely nothing about. So basically this signifies that Voyager has finally moved beyond the space of the Kazon or Talaxians or Vidians. And it's about bloody time too, as they've been traveling at high warp speed in one direction for over 2 years. But then again, I know they took a lot of major U-turns and detours several times, but still, Neelix's travel must have been ridiculously extensive if he went all this way. At any rate, this episode deals with Neelix going on hijinks adventure after another. He has this shady, no good friend to get him in trouble when all Neelix wants is a freaking map. So the premise sounds dumb, but the execution actually wasn't too bad. And I did like the exploration of Neelix's character, as he was genuinely worried that the crew wouldn't deem him useful anymore. And in the end, Neelix had to go bonkers just to make things right. So a decent episode, if not a very memorable one. So then comes Alterego, and let me cut right to it. I always thought of this episode as moderately bad episode. Whenever I put out a list of potential candidates for the top 10 worst episodes, this episode would always get mentioned, but never make the list. And after watching this episode again, I realized that I severely underestimated how bad this episode is. I think this may be one of the worst episodes in the entire show. So okay, I do like the concept of Harry going to Tuvok to try to suppress his emotions and be more like a Vulcan. That concept of a human wanting to be more Vulcan is an interesting one, but the way it's executed here is so dumb, as he's just being a moron and trying to use it to get over a crush. And we get a lot of stupid scenes with Harry acting like a moron, and then the show gets even worse when it turns into a cheap imitation of Fatal Attraction. I mean, seriously, when the hologram turned evil and started to hold Voyager hostage because she had a crush on Tuvok, this is some of the dumbest shit any Star Trek show has ever done. And the dialogue was just awful. I almost shit myself when I heard her say, "You can't just ignore me, Tuvok." Oh my god! After I finish my Voyager seasons reviews, I plan on doing and expanding my best and worst lists, and I'm telling you, this is going to be a very strong contender for worst episode. And speaking of horrible episodes, that shitstorm is followed up by another shitstorm with Coda. Now, reading the production notes of this episode, it stated that this episode was a combination of several different ideas that had been thrown around for a while, and it really shows. This episode is just a giant mess. It's all over the place and just awful. I remember when I first saw this episode where Janeway and Chakotay were trapped in a time loop where they were being killed by the Vidians over and over again. I was so excited. I thought this episode was going to be the best thing ever. But then the episode turns into shit when they bring up the storyline of Janeway getting the phage, where the doctor forcefully euthanizes her against her will. I'm sorry, but that's dumb. And what's even worse was the whole story of Janeway's dad coming to try to convince her that she's dead and she's a ghost and she needs to give up, and it turns out just to be some alien creature that comes whenever someone's about to die. That's just so incredibly cliche and dumb, and ultimately this episode is just a hodgepodge mess of several recycled track plots we've seen several times before, like, oh, cause and effect was popular, so hey, let's just do the time loop again, and let's just throw in the whole someone thinks they're dead but they're not really, like in the next phase, and oh, let's throw in the alien virus causing hallucinations like in Distant Voices, and oh, let's throw in an alien that's been around since history causing death like Wolf in the Thrall. The whole thing is just an unoriginal disaster, and I'm done talking about it. So, next we get to Blood Fever. Okay, so I'm going to have to admit something that may not be very popular, and I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me, and this is just my opinion, but this is going to be a reoccurring theme for the rest of my Voyager reviews, and so I'll have to start it now and bring it up. That I hate the Tom and B'Elanna romance. I hate it. I never accepted it, even after they got married, even after they have a kid, even after the show, they showed them in the future still being happy and married with their kid all grown up. I still hate this relationship and think it's bullshit. They never had any chemistry. In fact, it seems like the show was obsessed with trying to put Paris into a couple. First it was Cass, then it was B'Elanna, when this character really works much better as a single ladies' man. Why they keep trying to tie this character down is beyond me. And the two of them never had any chemistry before Season 3, and the chemistry that they did have in Season 3 was often forced and fake. Who B'Elanna should have been with is Harry Kim. The two of them had this chemistry from the very first episode that was really strong throughout the first two seasons. I totally would have bought them as a couple. And plus, it was such a dumb dynamic going, that they had going, that Kim was the one off having romances where Paris was the one in a long-term relationship. That did not work and made no sense. It would have worked much better the other way around. Hashtag Kim Lana. But overall, I think Voyager was the worst show when it comes to inner character romances between main characters. As whenever they have a romance that works, such as Kim and B'Elanna, which really would have worked, and Cass and Neelix, which really worked, or Janeway and Chakotay, which surprised me that actually really worked, and Seven of Nine and the Doctor, which they did really well. Whenever they have any good combinations like that, they break it off or they don't explore it further in favor of romances that do not work and have zero chemistry, such as Cass and Paris, B'Elanna and Paris, or Chakotay and Seven of Nine. Voyager constantly has failed romances. And as I said, you're going to hear me talk about this whenever we get a Tom and B'Elanna episode, because I always thought the romance was garbage and did not work, so get used to it. Call it personal bias, but whatever, that's just how I feel. However, getting back to this episode in particular, which is where this stupid romance all started in the first place, and a stupid subplot about B'Elanna needing to have sex in order to save her life, yet Tom was still refusing to do it in order to be a gentleman. I'm sorry, Tom, but how is letting your friend die being a gentleman? But regardless, this episode was annoying for multiple reasons. First of all, the fans have been waiting forever to see how Tuvok's Pung Far would be handled with in the show. But instead of dealing with that, they bring in a new Vulcan character who was introduced in just the previous episode, who we've never seen before, in order to explore his Pung Far instead. I'm sorry, but who cares? Also, the whole concept of having B'Elanna contract the Pung Far and have to go through it herself was ridiculous. And plus, the writers of this episode do not know how Pung Far works and completely misunderstood the events of mock time. In that episode, Spock's Pung Far was overcome because he thought he killed his best friend. It doesn't mean all you have to do is get into a fight and the Pung Far will just go away. That's dumb. As that's what's happened in this episode. Regardless of, they just, B'Elanna and Vorik fight, so their Pung Far just goes away. That's not how it works! So regardless of the cardinal offense of initiating the stupid Tom and B'Elanna romance, it is just a bad episode overall. So finally, we come to a good episode. with Unity. A lot of people complained about Unity when it first came out, as it was the first time we see the Borg in Voyager, and it's not really the Borg as we thought we'd see, as it's just a group of X-drones who form their own version of the collective, and the Borg cube that we do see is simply a dead, reanimated one that's defeated very easily. So many saw this episode as a cop-out. And it was, in fact, the backlash over this episode that led Voyager to switch gears from doing the Year of Hell that it had planned to do for the final cliffhanger and continuing on in Season 4 to do a more action-packed Borg storyline. But I have to say, especially in retrospect, I find this is actually one of the better Borg episodes the show has ever done. I find this a very interesting and very powerful character story involving Chakotay, who is starting to get neglected this season, and this problem will only get worse as the show goes on. And this was an overall interesting concept of former Borg members surviving using the power of the collective for good in order to heal Chakotay and bring about peace to a hostile situation. And I think it was handled really well. Plus, the sense of moral ambiguity this episode had was very well done, as they did in fact use Chakotay against his will to do something that put Voyager in direct danger. But at the same time, had they not done that, they would have all died. And I love that. That's the kind of moral gray area that makes you think that Star Trek is so good at. That being said, this wasn't a perfect episode, and I had some issues with them redshirting an ensign just for the hell of it, and destroying yet another Voyager shuttlecraft, because Voyager seems to have an unlimited supply of them. But I'll say overall, a great episode that wasn't deserving of all the hate that it got when it first aired. Okay, so then we come to Darkling, which is yet another episode I wasn't giving nearly enough credit for how bad it is. I mean, this is a horrible episode that most certainly will be a strong contender for my worst list. First of all, this is the episode that really kicked the destruction of Kes's character into overdrive, as she just comes off as a mindless sex object who's just running off having lustful adventures instead of the wise, empathetic, driven telepath that she was in the first two seasons, which was way more interesting. And it's not enough that they have to have Tom swooning over Kes, now that they have to have the Doctor swooning over her as well. And I like Robert Picardo. When I did my top 10 Star Trek actors list, Robert Picardo was in my top 10, and I stand by that decision. But this has got to be one of the worst performances I've seen in the entire series. His performance as the evil Doctor was so over the top, bad, fake, and forced. He literally came off as a cartoon villain. I mean, yeah, I'm going to kill you. That's literally what he sounded like. I mean, to say this performance is cringeworthy is an understatement. But again, I know how amazing an actor Robert Picardo is, so I blame the directing and the writing. And for that matter, the whole storyline about the Dr. Jekyll and Hyde thing just happens because the Doctor adds some personalities to his Matrix is so dumb. It makes no sense. Sure, these historical figures have a dark side, and I can see this having an unforeseen effect, but creating an evil personality that wants to kill people is just beyond stupid. So yes, another strong contender for worst Voyager episode. So next we come to Rise. Now, this episode in particular, I have to talk about the promo for it, because this is probably the worst example of an over-the-top, ridiculous promo, and frankly, is what I always think of first whenever this episode is mentioned, and what I remember most about this episode. And it's funny considering I only ever saw this promo a couple times when it first aired over 20 years ago. But anyway, I need to give some context first before I explain the promo. So at the time, NBC NBC was airing this miniseries called Asteroid, and it was huge, very popular. It's what everyone was talking about. I myself never watched it, but hey, it was sci-fi and it was airing at the same time as Voyager, so UPN obviously considered it a competitor. Anyway, the promo for this episode focused on the asteroid threat aspect of the episode, and it said, and I quote, "This is the episode that will kick NBC's asteroid." Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh my god! I mean, really, what more do I have to say about that? It will kick NBC's asteroid. I can't keep a straight face. Oh my god, I was laughing hysterically when I saw that promo. I'm like, are you fucking serious? I'm losing it. Oh god. I mean, do I really need to say anything else about that? That might be the dumbest promo I've ever seen for anything ever. But the episode itself actually had very little to do with asteroids and was more of a murder on the Orient Express type story, but instead of a train, it was a space elevator, and Tuvok and Neelix were the ones trying to solve a murder mystery while at the same time trying not to crash the elevator. And really, as with most outrageous promos, they didn't at all reflect upon the actual tone of the episode itself, which often was quite reasonable and measured. This episode in particular I thought was okay. It wasn't one of the most memorable episodes in the world, as I found the murder mystery story kind of thin, but what I think holds it up more is the character building between Tuvok and Neelix, which I find fascinating. I think this episode went a long way, even more so than Fair Trade, of establishing Neelix as a dynamic character in his own right, rather than just this dumb comic relief, which is also what he's been turning into ever since the end of season 1. I love how Neelix actually calls Tuvok out on his bullshit and says that he's not as emotionless as he claims to be, that he's actually arrogant and condescending and very rude to Neelix. And I think he's absolutely right. And seeing Tuvok and Neelix bond over this, I totally buy, and I think that this really worked. So I'd say this is actually a really good episode that kicked NBC's asteroid. Okay, sorry, I couldn't help myself. Okay, so next episode is Favorite Son, and this episode is one of the lowest rated episodes on IMDb and is in general seen as one of the worst episodes of the show, and frankly I don't agree. Don't get me wrong, I don't think that this is a good episode, but I don't think it's one of the worst either. The concept of Harry finding out that he's an alien from a planet filled with beautiful women, but then finding out it's a trap where the women kill the men by sucking out their life form in order to procreate was an interesting concept. And I found the execution of the episode interesting enough. No doubt this was based off of the original Wicker Man movie, as there are a lot of similarities. And it does go to show when a bunch of hot chicks appear to have a thing for a nerdy fellow, there's always an ulterior motive and they are up to no good. Now apparently the original intention of the episode was to reveal Harry Kim was in fact an alien the whole time, and apparently some even thought this was a great idea and a missed opportunity that they didn't do it, but I am not one of them. I, for one, hate it when they invent some contrived backstory for a character that we're familiar with for years and just introduce it all of a sudden and never buy it. I hate it when they did this for Dr. Bashir in Deep Space Nine by revealing he was genetically engineered the whole time, and I dare say this would have been much worse. I mean, seriously. Kim is an alien from all the way in the Delta Quadrant. He just so happens to be on a ship that ends up in the Delta Quadrant. That is one of the dumbest ideas I've ever heard of. And so I hated this episode at first, until it was revealed the whole time that he wasn't really an alien. He was just contracted a virus that made people think that he was, and the women there were just using him to zap his energy force. That made a lot more sense, and I think it fit quite perfectly. So I didn't really mind this episode. In fact, I almost selected it for episodes I like that everyone else seems to hate series that I did. Although with this episode it would be more like an episode I think is okay that everyone else seems to think is terrible. Okay, so next episode is Before and After, where here we have a reverse situation, as this is an episode I've seen on some top 10 lists, and many who speak very highly about this episode, but I never liked this episode and always looked on it as a disaster. There are several reasons for this. First of all, I find the beginning of the episode that starts in this hypothetical future that doesn't even come close to passing, as Kes will leave the show soon after this episode, to be very disorientating, as it has the effect of alienating me from the story and the characters. And I find the ending where after she makes all these small jumps in time, Kes all of a sudden jumps from the point in season 3 that we're at to the very first episode in The Caretaker. And only for a few minutes, just enough time to have some pointless nostalgia about the first episode, and then she goes back to being a child on Okampa, very pointless and ridiculous. Furthermore, I find going back to the moment of her birth worse yet. And then where she's a fetus and all that, extremely pretentious. Especially as it shows the cells organizing and reforming, then moving forward again for no apparent goddamn reason. And secondly, and just as important, I found the whole storyline of Tom Paris marrying Kes and having a daughter whom Harry Kim will marry the dumbest thing the show has ever done. I was so incredibly off-put by this as soon as I saw it. I absolutely hated this episode. First off, I mentioned the whole Kes and Tom romance concept was stupid, and secondly, although it is plausible, Kim could marry their daughter considering the fast acceleration of Ocampans. It's just way too soap opera-y and silly. And further, this episode is a huge contributing factor to what I described of season 3 destroying Kes's character. It became extremely obvious in this episode. They had no idea what to do with her. Now, the only bright spot in this episode is that it introduced the concept of the Year of Hell. However, at this stage, it was still planned on being the season 3 cliffhanger, and the plan was for the Year of Hell would in fact actually be a year and would take a prolonged story arc that took place over the entirety of season 4. However, the studio head stepped in and prevented that. And while I was still happy with what they did do in season 4, I still see this as an overall huge mistake and a missed opportunity, as having a season-long story arc of Voyager getting their ass kicked against a superior foe would have been just the shot in the arm the series needed. Because even though bringing in the Borg did work for season 4, this idea became tiresome by the end of the series. So they did in fact introduce the Borg a bit too early. Had they done the Year of Hell and then waited until after that to introduce the Borg, I believe that would have benefited the show overall, and they wouldn't have burnt out on the Borg so quickly. So watching this episode makes me a bit sad, as it just goes to show what never came to pass. Although they did do the two-parter, it still doesn't at all fit in the events of this episode. Some try to explain it away because of the time-altering nature of the Year of Hell, but that's a big stretch that doesn't hold up, because the Krypton tampering with the timeline wouldn't make it so Kes disappeared from the ship. So that's not really how it works. Regardless, I found this whole concept to be a failed disaster that is indicative of how the writers didn't really know what they were doing this season. So next episode is Real Life, which is yet another episode I've seen a lot of people speak very highly of, where I've always seen this as one of the worst episodes of Voyager. In fact, whenever I come up with these worst list contenders, this episode always makes the list. I was actually really shocked when I heard some people actually consider this one of the best episodes. I thought it was pretty self-evident that this episode sucks a lot. The basic premise is a tired, boring cliche track format of having an A story with a character doing some BS on the holodeck, while the B story is some bullshit anomaly that nobody cares about. And as for the Doctor having a holographic family, I mean, it was kind of interesting and kind of amusing at times, but mostly it was just ridiculous. Neither one of the versions of these families felt real, even after Tor supposedly tried to make it more real. The first version of the family felt like a 50s TV show fake happy family, and the second version felt like a 90s sitcom cliche of what a dysfunctional family was like. And the ending was a very forced and contrived attempt to pull at the heartstrings through melodrama, and I did not fall for it for a second. And the reason being is the whole storyline felt fake, and there wasn't helped by the fact that all of the actors that played this family were terrible. I mean, truly awful. So I didn't feel connected to these characters at all. So overall, I hated this episode and would in fact say it is among the worst episodes that Voyager has done. So next episode is Distant Origin, which is another episode that many seem to love. I've seen it on some top 10 lists. However, this time I'm not going to say I hate it. I actually liked it. But I will say I never thought of it as great. And I personally would never consider this for a top 20 Voyager episode list, let alone a top 10, but it's still a good episode. I just always thought it was like moderately good, not great. But what I remember about this episode is the promo. So yes, I'm going to get back to the UPN promos. So this episode came out around the same time as the Jurassic Park sequel, The Lost World, which is looked back on now as not a good movie in retrospect, but at the time it was huge and generating a lot of buzz. Now I don't remember what the UPN promo said specifically, I just remember it was trying to compete with The Lost World and present this as a big dinosaur episode. And while no one who works on the show has admitted it, I do get the impression that UPN pressured them into doing a dinosaur episode in order to compete with The Lost World. But I do have to mention I hated the cinematography in this episode. It was just too noticeable and too distracting with all of its Dutch tilts and extreme close-ups and odd angles and wide-angle lenses and stuff like that. Typically, cinematography should enhance the story, and it does its best really when it's not that noticeable. When it gets distracting and actually, detracts from the story and what is happening. But in terms of positives of this episode, I was actually happy that they showed some continuity by showing the Voth track Voyager by making references to their previous travels, such as coming across Hogan's bones on the planet from Basics and the space station from Fair Trade. I did like how most of it was shown through the Voth's perspective. That was also cool, but ultimately the plot was fairly simple and didn't have any lasting effects for the future, so it was a good but not great episode. So next episode is Displaced, which is an episode I actually forgot existed for a while, not because it's a bad episode. It just doesn't particularly stand out as being bad or good. Ultimately, I do think this was a fairly good episode. It was exciting and suspenseful and engaging, but it doesn't have any lasting effects or deeper meaning. What you see is what you get. A bunch of aliens slowly appear on the ship every 9 minutes, and every time one appears, one of the Voyager crew members disappears. So it appears that these aliens are trying to take over Voyager, and they are. And knowing Voyager, it appears that they will eventually find some way to take their ship back, and they do. So there's not much underneath the surface, even in the character stories. Although I know they try to focus more on this Tom and B'Elanna BS, but the story itself is simple. But it's exciting and it's very engaging, so it's a fun watch, but not the kind that leaves a lasting impression. I will say the thing I remember most about this episode is the third act, where Janeway manages to escape from her prison and bullies the aliens into giving her Voyager back, which was cool. So overall, it was a pretty good episode. After that, we get a worst case scenario. And I actually think this was a really good episode and one that stands out in Season 3. Now, typically I don't like holodeck episodes as it's become such a tired trope with Star Trek, and I've gotten really sick of it. People go on a holodeck, something malfunctions, they get stuck on the ship, in danger, woo, BS, whatever. But this episode actually really worked for me and stood out. Part of the reason I feel that it happened was because the holodeck wasn't just used to present a scenario from Earth's history, which is typically what they use it for. It's just an excuse to travel to Victorian England or World War II Nazi-occupied France or the Old West or Beowulf times or whatever. However, this episode is the first time I think the show uses the holodeck to show a what-if scenario from characters and situations in the show itself. And I found this fascinating. If you watch my review of Season 1, you might have noticed one of the major issues I had with Season 1 was how quickly they integrated the Starfleet and Maquis crews. That really bothered me. So I love the concept of a holodeck program that explores a what-if scenario of a Maquis mutiny and take over the ship. And what's interesting to note is that this program takes place pretty much between episode 1 and 2 of the first season. So again, it basically tells you how quick this integration was handled in the show, when really it should have lasted the whole season. So I do appreciate a look back at this transition, even if it did come 2 years too late. I always really enjoyed the concept of this becoming a huge, popular program that the crew were all playing and they love, and it was becoming a fad, and that it was originally intended as a training program from Tuvok, and he didn't really understand the entertainment value of it. That part was handled really well. However, the second half of this episode of Seska sabotaging the program to kill Tuvok was actually less enjoyable because it felt like a shoehorned way to create tension and suspense in the episode that didn't really work. Most of all, it makes no sense for Seska to have created the sabotage in the program to kill Tuvok before she was at it. First of all, why kill Tuvok in such an elaborate way? Secondly, they'd know she was responsible, so she would be at it, which seems incredibly stupid of her. But this episode was still a blast to watch and a lot of fun. I think it really works on that level. So finally, let's get to the Season 3 finale, Scorpion. So I already mentioned this episode came out after studio pressure after the disappointment over Unity to create a Borg episode that's more action and suspense based and, lack for a better word, more epic. Basically, they wanted a 2-part cliffhanger indicative of the best of both worlds. And as I mentioned, the film First Contact had just come out shortly before, which was wildly successful, so the Borg was still in people's minds. And I actually think the writers did a damn good job of pulling this off successfully. Not only did they manage to have a suspenseful and exciting story with the Borg that was completely original and unlike any Borg story we've seen before on Trek, but also strong character stories that explored the captain and first officer relationship better than any Voyager had done before. And in fact, I'd say even better than any Star Trek episode has done before, or since for that matter. Now, this part of it I think is actually, I actually think that it gets better in part 2, but I'll talk about it more in my Season 4 review. But with the Borg, they start with the focus on Voyager entering Borg space and being incredibly screwed, as their space is huge, so they're faced with a choice, making a detour which will literally add decades to their journey, or trying to just go through the space where the chances they'd be destroyed or assimilated are extremely high. Now, that right there is an interesting enough premise, but on top of that, they had this conflict where the Borg were faced with an even greater unstoppable enemy that were destroying the Borg and defeating them in war. So on the surface, the destruction of an enemy like the Borg may seem like a good thing, but it's discovered the other alien, here known only as species 8472, is even worse than the Borg and could in fact conquer the entire galaxy much quicker, and yeah, they're basically a much bigger threat. So this was a fascinating concept, but the way this was executed made it even more interesting, because the way it was executed was through exploring the characters on Voyager, and this idea Janeway had of defeating Species 8472 by helping the Borg and at the same time making a deal with the Borg to get them safely through their space created a rift between her and Chakotay. And you totally bought this conflict because you could see both of their perspectives as they both made compelling points, and that is storytelling at its absolute best. So it's not just the fact that you have a badass Borg war where you see 12 Borg cubes instantly destroyed, but more that they managed to tell this epic story on such a personal level that explored the characters in the show pretty much better than any other Voyager episode has. And that's what makes this episode truly exceptional and one of the best of the entire series. So I finally did it. I finally got through season 3. So now it's time for me to name my favorite and least favorite episode of the season. So let's start with my least favorite episode, aka the worst episode of season 3. So this one was actually a really hard choice for season 3 because, as I talked about in this video, the season was not good and it had a lot of stinkers. So I could have went with False Prophet, Sacred Ground, Warlord, The Q and the Gray, Alterego, Blood Fever, Darkling, Before and After, or Real Life. Any one of these would have fit as the worst episode of the season, but in the end, I think I had to go with Coda as the worst episode of season 3. This was just one hot mess, as it was very evidently just a bastard mashup of every Star Trek cliche done before a million times, all jumbled together in one incoherent mess with an extremely cheesy ending. I mean, I'm seriously considering that this episode may in fact be worse than Threshold. Although it's hard to beat Janeway and Paris turning into salamanders to mate and have little salamander babies, most of that episode up until that point actually worked okay. Whereas with Coda, nothing works. It's just a giant mess through and through, and its ending with a death-eating monster is almost just as ridiculous as Threshold's ending. Almost. So, as far as best episode of season 3 goes, the field for this category is much smaller, but there were some good episodes in season 3, such as Chasm, Unity, Rise, Displaced, and Worst Case Scenario. However, really, this choice only came down to 2 episodes. As there were only 2 episodes this season I would classify as truly great. And although my first instinct was to go with Scorpion, I do have to take into consideration that I'm not talking about both parts of Scorpion, just part 1. And part 1 was good, but it feels really incomplete and is mostly actually just a setup for part 2, so it's not as good as part 2. So taking that into consideration, I'm going to have to go with Remember, as Remember is a full episode in its own right, and it's an extremely powerful one with great acting, great character stories, and very powerful and meaningful stories that really make you think and feel and that have relevance to today's society, not just the Holocaust, but any like propaganda or bad things that are going around that you don't think are really happening. Is just very powerful overall, and you can ask nothing more of a great Star Trek episode. So as for my overall rating for season 3 out of 10, I'm going to have to give it a 3, very poor. I do have to take into consideration that there were some good episodes and 2 very exceptionally great episodes, as mentioned above, as well as a few mediocre okay episodes. But I'd say at the very least, half of the episodes this season were bad, and that is a very, very bad sign. And more than that, just watching season 3 is very noticeable how much studio interference there was, as they kept pushing them to up the sex and violence, as well as try to compete with popular films and shows that were airing that year, and by just copying them. It should be noted that Voyager was the first Star Trek show since the original series to air on a primetime network. Even though it's just UPN, it's still technically a network. And part of the reason Next Generation and Deep Space Nine were so good was because they were syndicated, and that allowed them the freedom to make the shows as they wanted to without much network interference. And after the success of the Next Generation, Star Trek still had a lot of clout, which I believe lasted through Voyager's first 2 seasons. But it was obvious that the clout had now run out with the Voyager's ratings slipping, and so the studio decided to interfere and intercede a lot. Now, in the following season, which I'll get to soon, the writers found a way to appease the networks while at the same time telling great stories, but it was obvious they had not yet learned that trick in this season, but they were trying to. But the result was they lost hold of who most of these characters were, to the point of destroying Kes's characters and making a lot of the other characters not as interesting. And overall, just cheapening the quality of the show, where to the point where they had to have a major overhaul in the entire show in the following season in order to save it. And I believe that is Season 3's biggest legacy. So that's it for my review of Star Trek Voyager Season 3. Thanks for sticking with me through this extra long video. I'll be back in roughly a month to cover Season 4 of Star Trek Voyager. I will try to hopefully return to my 45-minute time frame for that and future Voyager season videos. So be sure to keep an eye out for that, as well as I'm still taking episode review requests. So if there's an episode from any of the 5 Star Trek series you'd like me to review, just leave a comment below with the episode you'd like me to review, and I'll endeavor to do so. Also, check out my channel for many more videos on other shows like Game of Thrones, Dark Matter, The Defenders, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.